The year is 1918. A man crawls out of an unmarked mass grave with the other victims of the Spanish flu that ravages London while a war tears Europe apart. With the words of a blood-stained monster older than the nation itself in his ears, the man crawls through a world of gray towards the only splash of color, the red, pumping heart of his beloved sister, come to search through the bodies for him. As she embraces him tightly, he is overcome by hunger and tears into her throat, killing her and welcoming color back into this world.
My sweet brother. What have you done?
Mary! Oh, no! Mary!
This is Vampyr, Don't Nod Entertainment. A game of choices and consequences that begins with a choice that you can't make as a player, but you'll suffer the consequences for many nights to come.
Mary. No.
Part 1. Bloodlust. So far, when I've talked about games here, I've tried to talk about their politics, often the way that they fall short of living up to their stated goals and ideas. The inconsistency in how Assassin's Creed as a franchise portrays freedom as the goal of the Assassin Brotherhood, but how they often work with real-world power structures that were as oppressive as the ones they oppose, for instance. Vampyr certainly does have that problem, and I'll be getting to it later, but the way that it depicts the downtrodden as needing a champion and criticizes inequality while still justifying and condoning the hierarchy and wealth that creates disparity isn't what makes it an interesting game. What makes Vampyr interesting is the way that it does something that none of the other Vampyr games I've played have managed to do. It makes you feel like a vampire. It makes you feel like a predator, a monster that makes choices and takes it upon himself to determine who lives and who dies, feeding his unnatural hunger. In Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, feeding is a necessity, and dozens of unnamed individuals mill about. Barflies waiting to be seduced, prostitutes who will follow you into an alleyway for a few dollars, or drunken vagrants just waiting to be pounced on. None of them ever need to be drained dry, and none of them really matter as characters. Not so in Vampyr, where the dozens of characters who mill around every safe zone all have names and social circles and personalities. Each of them also comes with a helpful little reference card telling you how much experience their lives are worth if you lead them into a dark corner and tear out their throats. You can increase the amount of experience each life is worth by raising their blood quality through dialogue choices, where you learn about the citizens, get to know them, and uncover their darkest secrets and insecurities through liberal use of vampiric mesmerism to loosen their tongues.
Why does Dr. Tippett claim you're the main reason he keeps working? Tell me what Dr. Tippett did. Why do you have such a mediocre reputation among your colleagues, Milton? Corcoran, I want you to tell me about Mr. Connor. Tell me, Tobias, what exactly is your plan? Clayton Darby claims he will expose the crisis in Whitechapel.
You might even do errands for them, which, this being an RPG, often involves going to the far ends of London to murder and loot, and learn about their relationships with other characters in their social circle. You'll also want to keep them healthy, You are a doctor after all, and dispensing cures for fatigue and the cold is quite a bit of what you'll be doing to keep the status of every district high.
You are not a burden, sir. Healing you is my responsibility.
You'll also want to do it because a meal doesn't taste as good when it has a migraine. Blood quality and the way it's raised through a combination of conversation, eavesdropping, diary snooping, gossip, gophering, and kindly administration of medicine is a powerful mechanic, and one that is core to making the player feel like a vampire. It turns the characters into a taunting siren. Every character you learn clues about will become a juicier morsel, but at the same time is someone you've come to know and possibly even sympathize with. Even the worst characters, some of whom have dark secrets of serial murder and familial abuse, but then again, are you really one to cast stones when it comes to murder, also have something sympathizing about them, even if it's only what they might mean to the rest of the district. After all, if you drink the soul of the man with a temper and a high body count to go with it, what might happen to his poor ailing mother? Will she still be able to care for the orphan if her breadwinner son, the serial murderer, is dead? In some ways, it's clear from the outset that mechanically not much will happen to other characters. After all, no one will ever die just because you've killed the characters in their social circle that take care of them. Even knowing that, it's easy to put it aside and ignore it, to get lost in the moment and wonder what will happen to these people if you ruin their lives. Even if they're just coding in character models, it's easy to get swept up in their lives and stories. While that old lady may not starve if you rip out her son's throat in a dark alleyway, the game does still have consequences. This is a don't nod game after all, the studio famous for Life is Strange, the time travel high school adventure game. Vampyr isn't an adventure game itself, but it does still heavily focus on consequences. With every death on Dr. Jonathan Reed's hands, the game reminds you that the district will suffer the consequences of your action. With every death, the status of the district will fall, making characters more likely to be sick, which in turn makes the status fall further, and raising the prices of goods in the shops. It becomes easy for things to get out of control, and status to fall to a point where you'll have a hard time doling out curatives to keep colds and headaches away. If the status falls too far, the district will fall into chaos. Everyone will die, or at least go missing. The whole area will be overrun by enemies, and you'll lose out on any quests in the area, or, if you're unscrupulous, any blood bags you haven't drained. It's not the most elegant of systems, and even on hard mode I was able to keep any district from completely falling, even the one where, early on in the game, my bad decisions led to the pillar of the district, the heart and soul, the one who leads everyone and keeps the district from falling to epidemic like the rest of London. But at least served as a threat that had me stocking up on medicine, which I spent quite a bit of time passing out, even when I had to fight through mobs of enemies to do so. Part 2. Hard Choices. It will be trivial not to engage in the systems I just described, if not for one problem. Vampyr is a rather difficult game. Or at least, I chose the hard difficulty, knowing that I'm not actually good at video games. I can play them well, and I'm not flailing incompetently like someone who has never held a controller before. I don't have any motor difficulties, though I do get overwhelmed by keeping track of things. I have 70 plus hours on Dead Cells and Dark Souls, but in neither of those games am I the kind of skillful player who can wade into combat and duck, dip, dodge, and dive through the melee. I'm thoroughly average at best. But I have to admit, I really do enjoy the crap out of hard mode. The combat in Vampyr is incredibly tedious, and once you have the right stats, you can tear through enemies like tissue paper, and dash around like a lunatic, avoiding attacks and taking swings. You can up your slashing melee weapons through the path that will make them steal blood with every successful attack, and suddenly you won't have to use your weaker offhand weapon to drain enemies. Or worse, the increasingly hard to pull off stun, so that you can sink your fangs into the opponent directly like some kind of dirty peasant. After you boost your health and stamina and blood reasonably, and increase whichever combat vampire power you chose, most basic enemies won't give you much trouble. Sure, you'll still get in a pinch with the priests, who are always found with torch guys, or the Iker skulls, who belch out poison clouds, but for the most part, after about level 15, you'll breeze through every combat. And then you'll hit a boss, or a mini-boss style group of enemies you have to get past, and the boss will probably kick your ass. That's where the difficulty actually feels good. The combat in the game is honestly terrible and boring, and I'd often hold off on resting, just so I wouldn't have to clear out all the enemies I'd killed once more. For some reason, Vampyr really wants to ape Dark Souls, and uses a system similar to the bonfires. There are safe places to rest and spend your experience points, but when you do rest, the world resets with the same enemies in the same locations, with minor variations each chapter, as if you never murdered them. By the end of the game, the biggest killer in London wasn't the plague, it was me. At a certain point, anytime I was running errands, I'd give up on killing everything in my path and fighting each group of enemies I came across, and instead I'd just dash through them, since the enemy AI keeps the aggro range rather short. It wasn't the combat that made the game's difficulty interesting, it was what the combat forced me to do. As the game keeps reminding you, the blood of citizens is the fastest way to evolve, the game's term for leveling up. On hard mode, each individual enemy gives about 5 experience, and even the big tough werewolves only give about 8. You can get experience for healing citizens, or doing personal errands for each of them, and you'll get a decent amount of experience for playing the game's storyline, but the fastest way to evolve is the blood of citizens. Vampyr's difficulty means that you're constantly tempted to sink your fangs into everyone you meet, and you're stuck evaluating the lives of everyone around you. You can probably get through the first few chapters struggling, but confidently. But by about the 3rd upgrade to your mesmerism, you've probably already started collecting a list of which people you want to eat. For me, it was the second in command of the Wet Boot Boys. He's the first one I ate. He murdered a communist because one of the trade unionists had killed his friend. His friend was a racist who started a fight with a black man and got killed in the scuffle. The trade unionist who killed the member of the Wet Boot Boys wasn't even the same one that the second in command shot in retaliation. That was good enough for him. He was also paranoid about vampires because he once saw one attack someone. I proved that his fears were justified. There was also the overbearing mother of a teenage boy who attempted suicide. She might have meant well, but she was very clearly smothering her son and the source of his anxiety, so she had to go. Then there was the serial killer. He had an anger problem, and he was pissed off his mother took in an orphan. He kept killing people who pissed him off and didn't feel any remorse. I couldn't wait to get my mesmerism high enough to kill the fake priest. He had been going around setting fire to plague victims, claiming that it was God's will that they be cleansed. And then there was the woman who asked to end her suffering if I couldn't get rid of the chaos that another vampire had put on her. And then there was the abusive mother, and I got the bad ending. Part 3. The Limits of Scope. Well, one of the 2 bad endings. It wasn't the one where I become a monster, a plague upon the world, to match the one I cured London of, but it was still the bad ending, all because I'd eaten far too many people. While I definitely did do that, and I fucked up in the first big choice and led to the District of Whitechapel suffering, I feel like the game pressured me into committing all those murders. I just wasn't good enough to take on the final boss, and I needed to chomp. But I feel like I chose my victims well. I think this is actually one of the places that Vampyr failed. The moral choice amounts not to whether or not I took any lives, but only the lives that actually have personalities. After all, I killed thousands of members of the Guard of Priwen, but none of them really mattered. My actions in failing Whitechapel no doubt caused hundreds of unseen residents to suffer, but nobody major died. All that mattered was whether or not I ate the named people, regardless of whether or not eating those people would make the world a better place. This brings up another problem that the game has. There are a lot of people with problems, even ones that go beyond the extent of the plague of Spanish flu and the skull epidemic that threatened the safety of London.
but the cost was dire.
Take Mortimer Goswick, for instance. A suicidal young man, and while I can use my vampiric mesmerism to draw the truth out of him, I can't use it to do anything good for him, other than perhaps kill his overbearing mother, the source of at least some of his existential anguish. It won't make him happier, but it will at least give him both peace and money that he'll use to support the hospital, though I can't actually tell if that means anything tangible, despite the good an influx of cash would do for the Pembroke.
I know that perfectly, Doctor, for I waited for so long, hoping that the next minute would be less unbearable.
Carol Price is likewise abused by her mother, Caroline Price, a woman that Dr. Reed identifies as having some sort of mental illness that causes her to engineer accidents so that her similarly named daughter can be doted on and treated by doctors, all while thinking of herself as a clumsy and irresponsible girl who can't handle the real world. Reed implores Caroline to get treatment for her mental illness, which we'd now call Munchausen's by proxy, before she accidentally kills Carol. Your vampiric powers can make Caroline follow you to her death, but they can't make her see Carol as anything more than an extension of herself, a puppet that she can break and mend to get attention.
If no one stops you, you will kill her. You will keep on torturing her out of smothering love until she breaks or you hurt her too much.
How dare you? I carried Carol inside of me for 9 months. You men can't understand the bond between a mother and her child. I could kill.
Other broken characters include the woman with Cotard syndrome, convinced that she's a vampire. Will she hurt someone with her delusions of blood drinking? And then there's the soldier, back from France, who lies to everyone that his burns were from a German shell because he's too ashamed to admit that he was caught in a whorehouse fire. Will he come to terms with this shame?
Did you start the fire? Were you trying to avoid going back to the front? That's not uncommon, you know.
No. It's just that I was asleep when the flames reached the room.
There's the widower handyman, with an injured arm, unable to provide for his children as his doctors squabble over how to treat him. And then, of course, the two doctors themselves, one of whom is rude, concerned with protocol, while the other is affable and hero worships Reed, and wants to emulate his success at blood transfusions, though his methods involve unethical experiments. Will you side with one and stop the other through judicious use of murder? There are some stories you can change. Killing one of the two doctors will cause the handyman to lose that arm or get better, depending on which of the two you choose to embrace. But he'll still hang around the hospital as a potential source of experience points, doing odd jobs to support his children. If you kill the burned soldier, the woman with Cotards will be mistaken for his killer, captured by the guard of Prewin as if she were a real vampire, and left to die if you don't save her. There are characters with social circles that will fall apart without them, with their companions joining the guard or becoming high-level skalds. But these are few and far between. I experienced exactly none of these during my playthrough. If I killed the murderers and abusers but never got these extra story beats, what good are they? Murdering people who, at least by my reasoning, deserve it far less, seems to mechanically reward players, giving them mini-bosses who grant buckets of XP as if you'd embraced them, but doesn't have the negative penalty associated with it, helping you to at least get the slightly less good ending if you only ate a few people, tactically murdering decent enough citizens. It could be argued that it actually is showing off complicated morality, but only on a meta level. Beyond prying into people's lives by snooping through their things or asking leading questions, the only two ways to interact with named characters is through mesmerizing them and leading them into a dark alleyway to devour their souls, or using your blood senses to determine any current maladies they're suffering, and if you've brewed the right one up in the rotted plague-covered shanties that serve as hideouts, give them a curative that will keep their health up, at least for one night. These actions are so integral to conversation that they're given the bumpers and triggers on the controller. Mesmerizing someone and draining their soul might give you a large sum of experience points, but going around and passing out cold remedies made in a dirty bedroom will still net you a small boost. more than that, it will help raise the sanitary status of the district, which supposedly leads to less hostile enemies or even a complete lack of basic enemies in the area. Not that I can confirm this. Like I said, I ate too many people in my playthrough. Overall, with a game that features so many morally gray choices, the binary of good and evil feels too limited, and only in some places does the game feel like it's giving you the chance to actually heal people's lives with your vampiric powers, despite the ultimate goal of the game being to do that very thing. Take for instance the case of the serial killers. One of them is a grumpy man who lives with his mother and takes care of her. He also resents the orphan boy that she looks after and routinely gets pissed off and murders people. The only way to resolve that storyline is through murder. Kill the serial killer and obviously you've put a stop to him. Kill his mother and the orphan boy and he'll realize you're to blame and his anger will abate. Everything you can do to change the story involves murder. The other killer is a delusional street preacher, passing himself off as a priest, shouting fire and brimstone and blaming the Spanish flu on the wickedness of man. He even blames Dr. Reed and his scientific ways. Press just a little and you'll learn that fire is more than just a metaphor and that he and a young assistant went out into the city and burned the sick with oil and fire. You can do a mission to find his assistant, now succumb to madness and disease as a skull in the cemetery, and you can kill the preacher. That's about it. Killing either of these men won't raise the status of a district. Giving them medication, which will then allow them to go out into the world free of fatigue or headache or cold and commit more violence, won't lower it. Your only interaction is a binary choice of death is bad and medicine is good. The game seems to want a gray morality, but so many of the decisions still feel like they're an obfuscation of that Bioshock dichotomy of save, harvest. Again, there are a few handful of people whose lives improve if you kill someone else. Choosing the right doctor means the handyman can live and provide for his family. Killing Caroline will allow Carol to live on her own without abuse, but she certainly doesn't seem happy about it. And never within the scope of the game does she leave. Yet still, each of these deaths that marginally improve things will still make the district's health status more tenuous. Researching about the game to determine just what outcomes there are for every character's embrace, what strikes me is both the guides and Reddit threads talk about the justifications people have for embracing citizens, or even for turning Mr. Brexit into a vampire at the request of the Ascalon Club. A lot of the justifications extend far beyond the scope of the game. Turning Mr. Brexit into a vampire or not has very little impact on the game. And killing Caroline has very little impact on the game. But both of these choices hint at things that might happen in the future. And in the case of which crossroad characters you allow to die or turn into vampires, things that might alter the fate of London. It's easy to get caught up in that and want to make decisions that might change the world for good or ill, or that might make your eternity easier, even if those things never come up in the game. All of that is commendable and speaks to good writing, but for me the justifications were different. When I was met with the realization that Caroline Price was an abusive mother, I was torn. Jonathan's pleas to her to get help hint at a reconciliation, a healing. They imply that with psychological help, she could see her daughter as a person with agency of her own and not simply an extension of herself. Anthony Howell, Reed's voice actor, does a good job at conveying the Master Surgeon's emotional depth. But there is no way to make her better. There's no way to bring about that hinted at reconciliation, that implied healing. So I ate her instead. Look, I'm a blood transfusion specialist and a vampire, not a fucking psychologist. This way is a lot simpler. The game wanted me to conceive of a world beyond the game. It gave me no means to actually move things in that direction. So I shrugged and ate her, because she's an abusive mother. Her killing Carol is never going to happen, despite Jonathan's warnings, but that one at least is something that, believably, is likely to happen after the game ends. There are many places where you're given a choice between three options, usually marked by the same red Y featured in the game's logo. A good deal of these choices, which are presented as being meaningful crossroads, do nothing.
Strive to emulate
Often only one of them will
but
completely
it's
lock
a
you out of an
difficult place
option.
to make.
Sometimes you do have to pick the right one, but more often than not, nothing will change. You'll learn whichever hint about a person you were meant to learn, and the game will not treat your choice as being particularly relevant. At other points, these choices really are meaningful crossroads, where your choice determines who lives and who dies, and the effect it has on the district or the city as a whole is dramatic. Then other times you turn someone into a vampire and it's not really a big deal. It's hard to draw any thematic conclusion from this when there isn't really any thematic through line. The first of the major branching decisions actively punishes you for using your vampiric powers to take control of the situation, and the correct answer is to have chosen simply to do nothing but finger wag like a mortal. In every other situation, using the blue labeled option, the one that signifies vampiric mesmerism, is the best one.
You're right, Miss
The game wants you to heal London, and in key moments your decisions actually do matter, but in so many other ways they don't. The outcome to Dr. Jonathan Reed's personal story isn't even part of the main storyline. There is no failing London the way that so many players seem to have failed Whitechapel, using their vampiric abilities to mentally dominate Dorothy Crane into shutting down her illegal dispensary and breaking her mind until she becomes a powerful Skull. You will always save London from the Skull epidemic, and yet you can rarely save any of the individual people in it. Also, I seriously have to talk about the first major crossroads choice.
Suffering is part of the immortal condition.
Part 4. Pillars. Standing strong or falling. The second chapter of Vampyr concerns rooting out whoever is blackmailing the wealthy Lady Elizabeth Ashbury, the benefactor of the Pembroke Hospital and a powerful elder vampire. Tracking down the culprit leads you to Whitechapel, one of the game's many districts. Each district is a mostly self-contained area of the map with one or two safe areas where the non-player characters mill about, waiting for you to pry into their lives with questioning. The citizens of a district are all organized into groups of 1 to 3 called social circles. Characters in the same social circle will have hints for each other, and some quests will have you choose between two people in the same social circle. Embracing one member of a social circle is also where you're likely to see those few dramatic changes, where a character will become despondent and succumb to the plague, becoming a Skull, or give in to their anger and join the Prewin Guard. If you know about them in advance, you can even embrace key characters and gain one of the better ends, and the experience boost normally associated with wanton murder by fighting the friends and lovers of your victims and staying below the limits of acceptable murder. It doesn't count to kill an enemy, even if they're a named character. Blackmail in Whitechapel also introduces you to the community pillar system. Some characters have no individual social circle, but instead hold the entire district together, and without them, the district will be plunged into disarray, lowering the status and subjecting everyone to illness. Meaning that if you want to keep the district from going hostile, you'll have to take over and constantly hand out drugs. Each of the district pillars might also end up dead by your hand if you fail a crossroads decision. No pressure. Every one of those three-way Y decisions for one of the district pillars starts out with 2 mundane options, usually spare or embrace, along with a third, blue text option that only shows up if you've done a proper investigation and learned all that you can about the pillar in question. The blue option, which always involves some sort of vampiric power, either turn or charm, is also always the correct answer, at least from a mechanical gameplay standpoint. Since the option only shows up when you've done more work, it represents a reward for your due diligence as a doctor. Except for the first time. The first time that you use the blue option to charm Dorothy Crane after finding out all of her backstory, your reward is to utterly destroy the woman's mind and leave her completely incapable of helping the people of Whitechapel. Her clinic closes down shortly after. Her accomplice leaves his house in disarray and lives on the streets. Dorothy Crane's dispensary becomes a filthy, skull-infested place, with Nurse Crane herself becoming an ill-formed skull. The introduction to vampiric powers is really impressive, and it does give the message that using your vampiric abilities isn't always the best course of action. Unfortunately, the game doesn't really follow through with that.
You've convinced me of the sincerity of your actions and their noble justifications. But all the same, blackmail is a crime, and it will stop, Nurse Crane.
So, are you going to turn me over to the authorities?
Listen very carefully, Dorothy. You will erase from your memory everything you pretend to know about Lady Ashbury and Pembroke Hospital.
Let that rich bitch off the hook over my dead
Nurse
body.
Crane, enough. Listen as if your life depended on every word. I know you've a generous heart who gives freely to those in need, but you shall walk away from the shadier streets of your business.
I will never abandon...
Dorothy, the discussion has come to a close. Your clandestine activities in the Resistance are over. Let it go.
I'll let it go. Yes. All gone.
You know the
When met with this next crossroads choice, you can either let the sad saint of the East End continue his life as a corpse-eating skull, or you can embrace him, end his unlife before he gives into the temptation and eats one of his flock. Or, if you asked all the right questions and investigated, you can force him to drink your blood, uplifting him into becoming a full Ekon, which is without a doubt the best end, both in terms of mechanics and outcome, simply raising him up to a slightly better undead abomination. The only downside is spending precious experience.
Discoveries. Vampire blood would enhance your metabolism, perhaps even heal you. If what old Bridget says is true, I'll give you some of mine.
I'd rather not. It would be extremely awkward.
You have no choice, Sean. It's the only way to protect your chettle, those still amongst the living.
No, Dr. Reed. God made me this way. Who am I to disobey his will?
You believe that God's plan was for you to be abandoned at birth?
The Lord works in mysterious ways.
I can't imagine God intended for you to be molested by a priest in an orphanage. Drink, friend.
No.
I said kneel and drink. Now.
When you're forced to turn Mr. Brexit, that is, Aloysius Dawson, billionaire tycoon, vampire wannabe, and wall-fancying Scrooge, into a vampire by your vampire boss, simply killing him then and there, or giving in and turning him into a vampire, does terrible things for the people of London. If you do your investigating first and ask around about him, and ask the specific people who give out the hint you need, you'll learn that he used to be a #woke billionaire philanthropist until his brother died, and he became paranoid of meeting the Reaper himself. A personality trait that you can cure him of by grabbing his head and making demands with your smooth, silky vampire voice. Your boss at the Camarilla, I know I already used that joke once, but still, will be angry and kick you out, but he'll still be around later to offer you the blood of his supposed sire without so much as a boss fight, and in exchange for dealing with the other rich Ekon vampires around the city wanting to square up with you, Aloysius will die peacefully and leave his fortune to the poor, healing literally every single person in the city of any ailments they have. Letting Aloysius die a peaceful death is also the only time where a character dying actually makes things better for the city, which is something the game could have sorely needed.
No, there must be a way. I don't want to go like my brother did. I have money, lots of money.
Money won't ease your mind. I know you used to be a good and generous man, so I offer you the gift of peace, Aloysius. The tranquility of a true death.
I accept your offer, and I understand. No more fear, I will die a man of dignity, and a man at peace.
There are two more options to transform people into vampires. One does nothing but give you a a very homoerotic scene where Reed forces his blood down the leader of the Priwen Guard's throat. A scene that would have been more meaningful if McCullum had actually played an important part in the story beyond simply showing up once or twice at this point to taunt Reed. Whether you spare or turn McCullum doesn't matter. In the next chapter, he's there to give you the blood of King Arthur, no problem. Because he's important to the story in Chapter 6, you don't even get the usual option to kill him.
Welcome to the world through the looking glass. Bond. They were the
The
embodiment.
final crossroads why choice is to decide what to do once you find out that this whole bloody skull plague mess was the fault of Dr. Swansea, the man who found and rescued you from your state of confusion and has been your best friend in the weeks or months since. Having been beaten and tortured by Priwen, you realize that the source of the skull epidemic has been right at the hospital with you, giving you a bed to sleep in, and you're given 3 choices. Let die, no doubt painfully, embrace him and end his life, and also get that sweet, sweet experience boost, or pay 3,000 experience and turn him, even though his medical ethics caused him to do the unthinkable, and the result is nearly destroyed London. Swansea is the perfect place where the various options could have been meaningful but aren't. Embracing or turning him makes no difference, beyond gaining all of his juicy experience or not. And if you've already missed out on the achievement for embracing no one, it's really just a matter of how painful you want his death to be, or how much experience you want for this story beat. However Edgar dies, his death will sink Pembroke into despair, causing the largest dip of any character's death. If you turn him, however, he will go back to work the next night, cheerful as ever despite being a ghoulish walking cadaver. Despite claiming that your blasphemous gift is a curse, to let him live with the guilt of what he's done, you're left with the implication that his unethical experiments will continue, though he claims he now only experienced on himself, learning his lesson, and that his pride and arrogance might even make him want to take up the mantle of leadership in his secret society. None of that extends beyond the first ending of the game, much less the final credits roll. Mechanically and within the scope of narrative, saving Swansea by turning him into a vampire has no negative repercussions other than hinting at something bad that might happen well into the future. Every crossroads choice to determine the fate of a pillar rewards you for learning more and liberally using your vampire powers, while the only thing resembling an upside to dooming Whitechapel is that your new vampire girlfriend is proud of you for technically not killing anyone. Yet for quite a while I agonized about such crossroad choices. When I came to the end of Sean Hampton's questline and I saw that blue choice, I sat there for a good few minutes before eventually deciding to turn the game off, take a shower, and gather my thoughts. I didn't want to doom another district. I didn't want to leave Sean a skull, always craving flesh, but I also didn't want to sacrifice my experience and turn him into an Ekon, only to have him be even stronger and potentially more dangerous. In the end, I decided it would be the right choice, that he would be cured and uplifted from Skull to Ekon. And it was the right choice, because it was always the right choice to use vampire powers, except when it came to Dorothy. I think what bothers me the most isn't really that blackmail in Whitechapel is the only mission where learning more and using your powers is absolutely the worst choice possible. It's that aside from poorly conveying what Reed will do in that case, the outcomes to every major decision is ultimately a binary of whether someone lives or dies. Other than letting Aloysius die a natural death, the answer is always to make sure a character lives, even if it means blessing them with the curse of undeath. Except for McCullum, for whom literally nothing changes mechanically since he isn't a district pillar. Of course, I think it's worth looking deeper into why turning people into vampires is something the game so strongly encourages. Except, again, in the case of Aloysius Dawson. Part 5. Neoliberal Vampirism. Vampyr has some really inconsistent politics, and I had a bit of a laugh with them on my playthrough. It talks a lot about class disparity. The Spanish flu can take anyone at any time, but it's the poor who are hurt the most. It's the poor who don't have access to health care. The poor are the ones who struggle, and the Pembroke Hospital, which looks after the poor, is in a constant battle to provide for them. The poor react in various ways, some good and some bad, with one group in the docks being the Wet Boot Boys, a gang of criminals, while the other group are trade unionists who are routinely labeled communist. The pillar of the docks, the one who becomes a skull that you can turn into a full vampire, runs a night shelter and styles himself as a priest, despite having been on the receiving end of a real priest's abuse. The rich of the city are almost entirely insulated from the real problems of the city. You rescue a few of them having been captured by vampires, and your old war buddy is obsessed with vampires, but by and large they seem unfazed by the epidemic. The pillar of the West End is the richest man in London. He's also a human member of the Vampire Hellfire Club, Ascalon, which, as I previously joked, holds the position in the narrative of the Camarilla, the ancient group of vampire elders in Vampire the Masquerade that secretly control politics on a global scale as a catch-all for world domination conspiracies. They're wealthy elite vampires who secretly control British politics and protect the Empire from threats. At no point is it ever really brought into question whether or not they have the right to manipulate politics. They're rich, they'd be manipulating politics anyway, after all. The most that the game criticizes them for is being too distant and uncaring. They face criticism for Reed for wanting to kill all the skulls and going along with Aloysius' plan to build a wall, which is without a doubt the most on-the-nose political reference in the game. And of course, Elizabeth hates them for their misogynist ways. But there's never really a criticism of what they do, only the choices they make. This doesn't really stand out much, though. Throughout the game, there are dialogue options for Reed that are incredibly #woke. He'll criticize inequality and chastise the slumlord, but never once does he actually address the fact that he's an incredibly rich doctor from a wealthy family. His vampirism is much the same way. The game's loading screens and the crossroads choice to turn both McCullum and Swansea seem to imply that to be an immortal is a curse, a living of suffering and longing for the sweet embrace of death. But that never really seems to actually be the case. Reed is chosen as a champion by the Myrddin Wilt, an ancient Celtic figure that is also Merlin, to cure London of its skull epidemic. And he's given the option to live a peaceful life if you've managed to kill as few people as possible. In fact, the only Ekon you meet who suffers is William Marshall, who was poisoned by the disaster, the chosen by evil entity at the heart of the plague, and chose to cure Elizabeth instead of himself. Even then, he lives in relative peace, hidden away in Elizabeth's manor until she finally decides to lop his head off. Myrddin Wilt himself never really seems to be suffering. In fact, he was never mortal to begin with, never knew a life before immortality and blood. The game presents vampirism not as a curse, but a blessing. The Ekon of the Ascalon Club are all well-to-do and wealthy, and vampirism does not actually bestow any innate negative desires on its victims. There's a lust for blood, but the narrative implies that death isn't a necessary aspect of feeding. Elizabeth even feeds Marshall her own blood, and yet she still lives. Blood isn't a requirement. It's simply an addiction, something that vampires want and desire, but don't need. The game even makes this clear by allowing you to get through without embracing anyone, although eating Priwen Guard members or draining their blood with hacksaws and surgical knives doesn't count. Random Ekon show up as minor enemies in the latter half of the game. Wealthy vampires from around Europe who have come to watch England die and want to take part in the chaos. They're old money with no empathy, but vampires as a whole aren't inherently evil. We're shown that through the actions of Jonathan that we take part in, as well as Elizabeth's caring ways. Not to mention the beliefs and writings of the Brotherhood of St. Paul's Soul, the secret society of occult mortal scholars that Dr. Swansea belongs to, who make it their mission to find and talk to vampires, learning their stories, occasionally providing them with blood, and at least if Swansea is any indication, turning a blind eye to the wanton murder that they can cause for their fix. The Brotherhood's writings treat vampires as respectable fellows, ignoring their inherent blood-sucking and predatory nature and the harm they've done to the world. Much like liberalism and Vampyr treats billionaire philanthropists who donate fractions of their wealth to good causes while hoarding the rest and causing disparity. The Skulls, however, don't seem to get the same treatment. They're the vampire proletariat, practically zombies, malformed and hideous even when compared to the pale, red-eyed examples of Ekon throughout the game. Skulls are the standard enemy. They scrounge in the garbage, eat corpses, and transmit their curse through bites. It isn't until the latter half of Chapter 3 that you learn Skulls can be just as human as an Ekon. And even then, they're still living in the sewers like vermin, and only one of them gets a name and title card. The Ascalon Club wants the Skulls wiped out, and it's easy to see why, considering only about 24 of them aren't ravenous monstrosities, spreading plague and death. The Volcud don't even get that much. They're just big dumb blue beasts who serve as the servants of better, smarter vampires, and might be the same thing as the beast-type werewolf enemies. It's not really clear. Either way, it's hard not to feel like some sort of racial implication is there. Fergal Bansha, the first Volcud you meet, is the big, dark-skinned servant of Ascalon, who shows up to threaten you and is later a boss fight without any real lead-up or personality. And then later, Lord Redgrave doesn't really give a shit that you killed his man. Not that it matters, because you never see another Volcud of any importance throughout the game. All throughout the game, being an Ekon is treated as being almost more than human, but rarely like you're a soulless demon the way that other franchises treat vampires. You still have thoughts and emotion, and there's a hierarchy of vampires, and in the end, it's vampires who can save us from the disaster. Although, it's also the Morrigan and her vampires that cause the disaster, so, hey, it's just like how neoliberals treat wealth and disasters coming from inequality. Though, if I'm being honest, I'm probably putting more thought into vampires as metaphor for wealth than the game did. I doubt they intentionally set out to say that vampires are good and the rich people are vampires and the rich people are good. It's just that it comes out that way because, well, liberalism is the dominant ideology of the Western world, and maybe the billionaires are the problem tends not to come up that much. The Ascalon Club is condemned for its sexism, but not its right to exist, because, well, someone has to protect the Empire, right? Just don't think too hard on what the Empire is, or who it needs protecting from. There is, however, one place where vampirism is treated as a curse, an undesirable outcome that results in damnation. Part 6. There's Something About Mary, and the game's other one. So far, I'd almost forgotten entirely about Jonathan's sister, Mary. Her death is the catalyst for the entire game, but in a lot of ways, she's not really an important character. She's another of those aspects where the themes and plot seem to fall short. As I said earlier, Vampyr ostensibly portrays itself as a game about choices. But you, the player, don't actually make the choice to embrace Mary, not even in a cutscene with one option. Jonathan might make the decision to rip his poor sister's throat out, but you, the player, never do. Jonathan also never chooses to turn Mary, but that's exactly what happens. Regardless of your personal choices, at the end of Chapter 3, you'll face Mary in the cemetery where you watched her being buried. Once you've defeated her, you'll put her down like a dog. That's the metaphor that she gives you because she's too mad to continue existing. She's cursed forever to hear your thoughts the same way that Mirrodin Wilt will occasionally intrude upon your own life. Not only is Mary coming back to haunt you a punishment for a choice that you as the player never actually made. She's also an aberration among all the other people whose lives you can end with a bloody pair of fangs at the throat. Many of the named characters give in to the depression and desolation of the plague and become skulls, and one can even become one of the werewolf-like Volcud beasts, but never it reads hands, or fangs as the case may be. No other Ekon is created by accident, and while Mary's strength is remarked upon, she's likely stronger than Jonathan at this point, no doubt from eating NPCs we never meet. No one ever comments on how odd it is that she was turned without Jonathan willingly giving her any of his blood. There's a small smear of it that gets on her lips after Jonathan kills her, but that's about it. But if the game isn't going to comment on it, there's no real reason why I should either. The biggest problem is that Mary is there and then gone. She's important in the first half, and Jonathan's motivations are rather selfishly to find his maker, blaming him for Mary's death. Even though it was Jonathan who tore her throat out, as the rest of the game tells us, he made that decision of his own free will, even if he was under duress and really famished. There's even a different outcome based on whether or not Reed has killed anyone up to this point, with Mary embracing their mother in response to Jonathan's arguments that he needed to devour the souls of the innocents so that he could search for answers. But Mary herself is a thematic and narrative dead end. She has little to do with the overall plot to end the Skull epidemic, and while she does have to do with the themes of consequences, she's the consequence of an action that you, as the player, never actually chose to make. Even her angry, hateful nature never amounts to anything, except perhaps, if I stretch, a parallel to the blood of hate. But Mary isn't an Icor. She's not the disaster. She's just angry because, much as Jonathan heard Mirden's voice, she heard his. Except that after Mary is driven mad by Jonathan's voice, Mirden is practically silent until the end of the game. It's a "this could be you" that goes nowhere. Yet the entire thing is really well done. It was very emotional and I loved it. I loved this chapter, and I loved the encounter with Mary, even though the combat is absolutely terrible. Even if the only difference between eating the priest Mary brought or not eating him is whether Mary scolds you or whether she regains her health. There was never going to be any difference in the outcome, but it was still a satisfying story all on its own, which is really something worth mentioning. What's also worth mentioning is how the game treats women in general. Mary is just one of many crazy female bosses. There's a specific type of enemy that is a skull utterly ravaged by pestilence, that spews out toxic bile that deals aggravated damage, and explodes into a cloud of poison when it dies. All of these ill-formed skulls are women. There are a few scant werewolves that are also gross plague beasts, but mostly the worst enemies are the women affected by the plague. When you finally do investigate into the source of the epidemic, you come across more women who are mutated, eventually tracking the source of this spreading infection down to an old theater. There, a delusional actress awaits you, dressed for Bilotti and carrying a cavalry saber in her one good arm. Her other arm is a twisted, cancerous mass that springs out across the combat arena to swat at you, and is covered up for the first half as she battles you to a rendition of Habanera from Carmen. Later, Reed puts together that this twisted, hate-filled, mutated skull woman is also the same as the other hate-filled, twisted, mutated skull woman from earlier in the game. A minor NPC that you meet twice before she's revealed as the first of the game's two final bosses. When you track her down the second time, you learn that she's ill and mutated, and Reed seems to have hope that she can be cured. You never see her again until she's murdered all of the people who are helping her and is the final boss. The game has a thing with mothers. Emmeline Reed is a distant, flighty persona, not all there after the disappearance of her husband and the death of her family. If she survives her encounter with Mary, she's left confused and mentally vacant, believing she's talking to her dead family members when no one is there. She's probably the nicest of the mothers in the game. I've mentioned before how Miss Goswick and Miss Price are terrible mothers who deserve the cold embrace of death, But it's a terrible relationship with her mother that leads Doris Fletcher, that actress, to become an Ichor Skull, and brings her desire to see all of London infected by both the Skull epidemic and the Spanish flu.
And farewell.
Farewell, Doris.
This isn't a social.
Fletcher's mother, Harriet Jones, neither the MP for Flydale North nor the Prime Minister, is perhaps the second worst mother in the game. A violent old bat even before her transformation into a disaster. Harriet was terrible to her daughter and then terrible to London. Of course, I did say the second worst, because the final boss is the worst mother of all. The mother of vampires, the Red Queen, the Celtic goddess of death and doom herself, the Morrigan, or at least her avatar. Once you trounce your mother's avatar, she goes back to sleep, for now.
Then go back to sleep, my queen, and smile at us from your dreams. Nothing, since she only dreams of it. In the ancient tongue, when I was young...
When speaking to Mirrodin Wilt later, he explains that he essentially embraced Jonathan to entertain their mother, because if she doesn't cause a little chaos, kill a bunch of people, spread a plague or two every now and then, she gets really bored. But if Reed hadn't been there to give her a good fight, she'd have emerged fully, swallowed the stars. You know the drill. You can also ask him about why all the Ichors are bitter women, as if men couldn't handle becoming one.
I noticed that all the Ichors were female, as if a male couldn't endure the metamorphosis. Harriet was also a bitter...
In his typical aloof tone, Mirrodin sarcastically says,
If the Morrigan prefers despoiled women to become the vessels of her wrath, we should be thankful that but one disaster hath been cast upon this wobbling world.
Women, am I right? This guy knows what I'm talking about. Then there are people with father issues, though they're few and far between. Reed's father is a distant man who left his family to go die where they couldn't see him. You do a treasure hunt that he left you and learn how much he loved his family. There's also one woman you rescue from an incel vampire who talks about her complicated relationship with her father who died trying to save her. Biggest of all is Lady Elizabeth Ashbury, whose maker is another of Merlin's chosen champions. Though William Marshall saw himself as a champion of God, and Mirrodin Wilt as the Archangel Michael. A couple thousand years, and apparently he never realized he was a vampire. Ashbury herself is one of those women who is treated a bit awkwardly, with her role being to mentor and fall in love with Jonathan, even if you eat her adopted daughter. When she finds out that it was Swansea using her blood for unethical blood transfusion experiments on Harriet Jones that created the Skull Plague, she freaks out and flees, understanding that she's a healthy carrier for the disaster plague because of very complicated reasons that happened centuries ago that frankly aren't that important. Part 7. The Good Bad Binary. After Mercy killing her vampire daddy, Lady Ashbury is ready to take her own life in the flames of the burning library beneath her castle, wanting to end the line for good to make certain that the plague is never spread again, or at least not because of her. It takes Jonathan's conscience to pull her out of it. This is what your gameplay is led up to. Depending on how many people you've embraced, and only embraced, you'll get one of 4 endings. First, Reed convinces Elizabeth that he can cure her, and that until he does, they can live among the wilds, never to give in to their cravings because he hasn't killed anyone other than Mary. 2. Reed convinces Elizabeth that he can cure her, and until he does, they'll stay locked away in their castle with only old Bridget, the sewer skull, and eventually the internet, as their connection to the outside world. 3. Reed attempts to convince Elizabeth that he can cure her, and she rejects him, saying that she can't trust him after he's betrayed her, though how specifically I don't know. She pushes him away and walks into the flames. Jonathan then goes on a depression-induced murder spree. 4.
I am
Reed
death.
doesn't even bother to
Jonathan,
convince Elizabeth he can
wherever
cure
I
her,
go.
and just gives a straight-up supervillain speech. He only succeeds in convincing her that there's nothing left to live for if he's a monster, and then he goes on a wrath-induced murder spree. I got the third
What do you
ending,
mean?
and it felt suitably bittersweet narrative, but from a thematic and gameplay standpoint, it just fell flat. The culmination of your choices throughout the game, which again are at some level forced by your skill. If you aren't good enough to beat a boss, you will need to murder some
That is a
people,
risk I
assuming
cannot
you have a
take.
finite amount of time on the
I won't
planet.
bring another such
Don't want to
disaster
spend it
into this
grinding.
world.
Are 2 levels of good ending and 2 levels of bad ending that only actually matter in the game's epilogue. And the only of your choices that matter are whether or not you kill named characters, regardless of the morality of the characters you did eat.
I forgive you.
I know that game designers also have a finite amount of time on this planet and don't want to spend it coding branching paths, especially when they're already worked to the bone in ever-expanding crunch time. But it's still always so disappointing these choice-driven games end up having endings that don't really meaningfully care about the choices made throughout the game. Especially when ultimately what matters isn't how Reed confronted both his immortality and the Skull epidemic. It was his relationship with Lady Ashbury, something that the player has no actual control over. A moral choice becomes a metaphor for love.
One prayer for the summer.
Having your ending tied to your morality is fine, but having your morality tied solely to how many people you chomped on is a bit frustrating, especially when you can murder thousands of people by the time the game is over. But most of these living, breathing humans have no name and are just working-class racists trying to kill you. Having district health only go down when you kill people and only go up when you heal them is frustrating. The game feels like it wants to give players gray moral choices, but having a gray morality means having choices that don't always give good or bad responses. Having district status go down when I give one of the 2 serial killers medication because they're more able to take lives would be a great mechanic. Having the district status go up when I murder one of them would also be good. Having choices that result in some good things happening and some bad things happening would also be nice. There are a scant handful of places where murder improves a life unequivocally, but even then, that stands as a strike on your permanent record and you'll still get a worse ending. I like Vampyr, I really do. I've complained about a lot here, and in some ways, after finishing it, I've come to like it a lot less than I did when I was actually playing. But I think that, too, is something that can be enjoyed and savored. A lot of games and movies and books are actually pretty shitty and lackluster when we look back on them. Star Wars and Harry Potter are both massively popular franchises, but it's very easy to critique them and find flaws in their narratives and themes that encourage a deeply problematic worldview. Both franchises are still ones that people love, even when they've torn them apart and criticized the themes of divine right, strength of blood, moral relativism that always favors the heroes. Making you ignore those things and enjoy the ride is something to be praised in a game. And even during the story beats with Mary, a segment that I consider a plot cul-de-sac, I was engaged and emotionally invested in Dr. Jonathan Reed's story, his quest to save London from the wrath of an eldritch horror. I just feel like a lot of the disparate elements don't really come together. The game is greater than the sum of its parts, which is good, because most of those parts are actually a sloppy mess when examined. The combat feels so at odds with the well-done narrative parts of the game, but even many of the well-done narrative parts don't work well when combined. The tight, systems-driven gameplay is interesting, but unfortunately rather shallow. And the investigation parts of the game, which were by far my favorite, this game is without a doubt the best detective game since Murdered Soul Suspect, which I'll get around to covering one of these days, all really only meant getting more story out of people and getting more experience, but most of those people you honestly have no reason to murder. All the good parts of the game, of course, feed back into the combat, which isn't all that great. But at the same time, the game would feel very hollow without some way to show off the fact that you're a powerful undead monster capable of utterly murdering scores of people, assuming you've fed, which you only need to do because the game keeps leveling up all of its human threats. It's one big loop, but the most obvious part of that loop, the combat, is not very good. But I did say that I liked the game, so I want to end by talking about one aspect that I think it does incredibly well. Part 8. Vampyr the Masquerade. But there's a Y in it. Do you get it? Vampyr is a better Vampyr the Masquerade than Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines, and frankly, better than the bloating, shambling corpse that is Vampyr the Masquerade to begin with. I know it's something of a bad idea to admit, but I hate Vampyr the Masquerade, and I even hated Bloodlines. I have this irrational hope that Bloodlines 2 will be a game that I actually enjoy, because I am a fool. For the benefit of anyone unfamiliar with the tabletop role-playing scene that exists beyond Dungeons & Dragons, Vampyr the Masquerade was a role-playing game from the 90s that took Anne Rice-inspired brooding vampires and brought them to the dining room table with a Shadowrun-inspired rules set of rolling fistfuls of the same kind of dice, in this case, 10-sided ones. Since this was the 90s, there was also the liberal application of cool stereotypes and lots of edgy bullshit. It was a setting that got a lot of flack for pandering to SJWs before pandering to SJWs was a thing, while also being a setting where Asians all know about the supernatural and are proficient at kung fu regardless of their specific ethnicity, but pretend to be ignorant. The World of Darkness game line was big and varied, with mages and werewolves coming out alongside Vampyr, and eventually they were joined by changelings, people, usually children, who found out they were actually fairy nobles, demon, changing breeds, werewolves, but not wolves, mummy, they're mummies, wraith, which is ghosts, kind of, and a whole host of incredibly offensive and bad taste vampires from non-white countries. Vampyr was always the biggest property. Masquerade had a few features that have become popular since. The main one is that all of its vampires are part of one of a handful of world-spanning secret conspiracies. The main one of these, the one that players are assumed to be part of, is the Camarilla. They're the vampire good guys, for a rather relativistic definition of good. The Camarilla is primarily composed of elder vampires who get together and plan out their secret plots. The Camarilla could be summed up as every anti-Semitic conspiracy theory of Jews controlling the world, except they took the metaphor of Jewish people as vampires and said, the vampires are sexy. Usually players will still be at odds with the members of the Camarilla, namely the prince of their city, but just as often players will have personal goals to join the upper echelons, or they might even start as high-ranking members of the city's Camarilla factions. Vampyr has something similar in the form of the Ascalon Club. Now, the Ascalon Club that you meet in the game is rather lackluster, and with the city falling apart, you really only meet a handful of them, and they all use generic models except for Lord Redgrave, who could be seen as the prince of the city. Vampyr clearly took inspiration from Vampyr, both Masquerade and its later reboot of Requiem. There are similar terms like aggravated damage and embrace, although the latter is used differently. In Masquerade and Requiem, embrace means to turn someone into a vampire. The Ascalon Club feels far more Requiem than Masquerade, with its focus solely on English, but it's hard to imagine that Dontnod were completely unfamiliar with Masquerade. There are other similarities, of course.
But we cannot allow the disease to threaten the prominent heads of Great Britain.
The Nosferatu clan are hideous and malformed vampires who live in the sewers in Masquerade. They have unearthly strength, but they're all grotesque and must hide themselves away from prying eyes. This isn't much different from the sewer skulls, although Nosferatu have a lot of frankly ridiculous baggage, like the fact that in modern settings of Masquerade they're all computer nerds and have high-tech surveillance network, which, remember, this game line ended in 2004 when blackberries were considered cutting edge. The sewer skulls don't have any hidden cameras, though old Bridget does seem to have a lot of knowledge about what goes on in London. There are other differences, of course, and the idea of human cannibal underground dwellers isn't limited to Vampire the Masquerade or Vampire. But it's not a similarity. Where Vampire really shows its hand as a game inspired by Masquerade, and where I think it really outdoes Masquerade, and in particular where it ends up being much better than Bloodlines, is with the eldritch horror of vampire progenitors. In Masquerade, the first vampire was Cain, who was cursed by God for killing Abel, and whose damnable progeny was the cause of the Great Flood. It's this Great Flood that gives the oldest and most powerful of vampires their moniker, the Antediluvians, from before the Flood. The Flood. While Requiem would later choose to give vampires varied origins, with many of the lineages converging from different parts of the world, Masquerade instead tied its vampires heavily into a Christian mythos. Woe be to any immortal when the Antediluvians arose, because they'll eat 1d4 investigators per round. Masquerade is far from the first vampire setting to have ancient, all-powerful vampire originators whose awakening foretells the end of all things. After all, like a lot of things, including the Vampire Secret Society, White Wolf clearly cribbed the idea of vampire gods from Anne Rice, with Queen of the Damned coming out a few years before Masquerade. In it, the vampire queen Akasha is awoken by the vampire Lestat, who, in the previous book, joined a rock band. I really need to go back to the audiobook, because it's such a ridiculous concept. Akasha's awakening is a lot less dramatic than the whole blood on the moon, star of destruction thing that Masquerade would later adopt, but the concept of the antediluvian ushering in a global catastrophe is all there. Vampire has a similar plot, but in my opinion it handles the details a lot better. It feels more like Requiem, where, although the primary origin of vampires given in the game is that of the ancient Blood Queen of the Celts, there's hints of foreign vampires, like the Volcud, and even the terms Skal and Ekon aren't exactly British. Much as games of Masquerade will often feature parental troubles and tease the appearance of antediluvians, so too does Vampire, with Jonathan trying to figure out who his maker is, and eventually, rather unceremoniously at the last minute without much in the way of investigation, learns that he was chosen as the champion of Myrddin Wilt and sets off to fight the avatar of the mother of all vampires, who will still one day wake to the song of eternal hunger and the blood of hate and, devour the world or something. The tying of vampirism to the Arthurian myths and Celtic lore is something that feels unique and interesting, but at the same time, still in the vein of Akasha and Cain, though it definitely leans more to the side of Requiem than Masquerade. This is a positive for me, since I find Requiem's more varied and less certain origins to be better than Masquerade's way of doing things. For there's only one single source of vampire, and that's the blandly Christian one, where Christianity references are about as deep and meaningful as the ones found in Neon Genesis Evangelion. If anything, I wish they made the connection between Myrddin Wilt and the Merlin of Arthurian legend more overt. It does get dropped almost as an afterthought in the epilogue that King Arthur was both a vampire and one of Myrddin Wilt's other champions. It would have been nice to see that talked about. The way the game teases this deeper and more powerful entity that serves as the source of all vampires, while still giving you the chance to meet her avatar and face it in combat, make sure she stays both entertained and asleep, is a balancing act that I much prefer to the way that Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines constantly teases the presence of antediluvian power in the events of the city, but the ending is several slogs through corridors and corridors and corridors of gunfights with a very early, very shoddy version of the Half-Life 2 engine that all culminates in a bunch of unsatisfying nothing. I know Bloodlines has its fans, and some people even like the ending, but I'll talk about how much I dislike that game some other time. Suffice to say, I think Vampire handles the ancient evils in a much more satisfying way.
And I am not fully convinced
If anything, my only complaint is that Vampyr teases at these things early on, ignores them for a bit of faffing about, and then at the very end of the third act and in the epilogue gives you all of its lore and tells the Arthurian connection mostly through late game dialogue. At least Bloodlines does layer the implications on thick throughout, even if ultimately they amount to nothing beyond the idea that maybe Cain was your cab driver and wants you to blow up some no-account prince in the boonies for no real reason. Shits and giggles, I guess? No! It's about what's good about Vampyr, not what's bad about Bloodlines. Stop that, me. Anyway, I really did like this game. If you haven't played it, but still read all this, hopefully I haven't put you off. I feel that I've been too hard on a game that I really did enjoy. It's not the main story with the Skull epidemic that is the interesting part. It's the way that you uncover everybody's secrets and pry into their lives. If anything, the reason that I have so many criticisms of Vampyr is that every part of it, except the combat, which I cannot stress enough, is pretty tedious and feels at odds with the good parts of the game, even though it's so integral to them. It's so good that I really wanted more from it. I wanted more people to investigate. I wanted more stories. I wanted the stories to be more impactful. I wanted my choices to have more consequences, both good and bad, beyond murder bad, medicine good. I wanted more interconnections between people. I like the concept of social circles and pillars and district status, so much that I actually want to incorporate it into my notes for running tabletop games. I feel like breaking the setting down into discrete parts where there are 6 or 7 individual little NPC groups that have information about each other, all tied around a central character, could be very useful. You could reflavor the abstract notion of status to be how well factions actually view your players' characters. You could expand the concept of pillar to have it so that you can replace the pillars of the community with ones who favor the players. Even using the hint system could help with running a role-playing game. Simply give each character a few facts about them that other players will need to pry to learn, or even that they might need to do some snooping for. It's not exactly unique, but framing it this way can be really helpful. There are so many things from Vampyr that I want to see more of. I hope that other games learn from it. I want to have more games where you talk to characters, learn about their lives, and then use what you've learned to decide who lives and who dies. But I want there to be meaningful choices. Choices that change more than whether a handful of characters join an enemy faction so that you can kill them with a clear conscience later. Vampyr's district stuff, the way that you talk to characters, is so very good, and I really hope to see more like it in the future. It's not quite an adventure game or a visual novel in those parts, but it still feels really good, and it's obvious why the most popular thing this developer did was one of that new style of adventure game that focuses more on dialogue than rubber chickens with pulleys in the middle. I've had a lot to criticize, and I feel bad because in editing this I thought of all sort of things that I want to talk about, but in the end, Vampyr is something I want to see more of. Also, this isn't a review or anything, so I don't talk about things that I can't critique the politics or theming of, or talk about what kind of ludo-narrative it invokes, but the music in this game is really good. The West End District's Safe Zone music is this really haunting strings piece that reminds me of Silent Hill. Why do only indie games ever seem to release their soundtracks as separate things? Thank you to everyone who made it through this awkward first attempt at a video essay. I'll try to get better in the future. I'd also like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon. You can join them at patreon.com/Aspel. Thanks as well to Casey Explosion on Twitter, who gifted me this game that I've now devoted so much time to. If you'd rather read this essay, you can find it and other essays I've written at medium.com/estrusflask. Links for those will be in the description.